Welcome, author, editor, and writing coach, Aimee Walker. Yay!
Hi, that's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm so excited, Aimee, that you actually reached out and that you wanted to talk tropes because I have had this requested by several listeners and writers. So like it was perfect timing. It was kismet.
Yeah, everyone loves talking tropes, really.
Right? It's
Yeah,
such a great, I think, marketing tool and a really great way to find your readers for a lot of authors. And it kind
yeah,
of helps hone your writing.
yeah, totally does. And I think people kind of underestimate how much it does. So yeah, that's kind of where the book came from.
And in case listeners don't know, can you tell them a little bit about yourself and your book?
Well, as you said, I'm an editor. I'm a romance editor from Northern Ireland. In case you don't know, Northern Ireland is a part of the UK. If you don't understand my accent, I apologize. I'll try and speak slowly. I am full-time freelance editor, mostly for indie romance authors, and I do all levels of editing and a bit of coaching. I tend to coach my own editing clients when they need help with different parts of the process and if they get blocked or anything. I run a Facebook group with my colleague Sarah, and it's called Romance Editor Q&A. We had a weekly Trope Tuesday feature that I ran, and that's about 2.5, 3 years ago we started it, and it was that kind of drove me to write the book. I was every week I chose a different trope and asked the members to kind of tell me what they liked or didn't like, what issues they found when they were writing those particular tropes, and was quite surprised and shocked sometimes at how dramatic the reactions could be to certain tropes. And that was kind of what spurred me on to do a bit more research and think, why that was. And when I asked them about the tropes, they didn't necessarily tell me why they didn't like them or what the reason was that it was their favorite, or oh, I absolutely detest that trope. And I'm kind of going, that's an unusual reaction. So I thought it was worth looking into, and that's kind of where it all came from.
I like that you mentioned that too, because I find that too a lot in several authors I've talked to, several readers I've talked to. It's either you love a trope or you really don't.
Yeah. And they very rarely say anything beyond that surface level of,
Mhm.
this is my favorite trope and this is the trope that I really hate. And kind of, why don't you like that book, or why wouldn't you read that book? And it's, oh, because I hate enemies to lovers, or I hate Secret Baby, or, whatever it might be. But they don't actually say why they hate it or why they wouldn't even give it a shot.
Mhm.
So that really kind of piqued my interest, let's just say, and that's why I started to do the research that led to the book.
Well, and I love that in your new book, Top Tropes, A Romance Writer's Guide, it kind of digs a little bit into that psychology, like you were talking about, and then kind of what draws readers into it or what will kind of push them away. It rates
Yeah,
contemporary romance tropes in different categories like tension, banter, controversy, and believability. There's such a wide variety of tropes. And like I said, it's either your fave or it's not. So, how did you narrow down the selection of the rating system for tropes?
well, the premise of the book, the rating system, comes from an old card game. I actually found out recently that it isn't a thing in the US, or that a lot of people in the US don't know about it. So I'll kind of explain it briefly, but it's an old card game called Top Trumps. Nothing to do with your Trump. um, it basically takes a category. So if you're a kid and you love dinosaurs, the cards have a different dinosaur, and you play along with your friend, and you go, oh, is your dinosaur bigger? Do they win in size? Do they win in, are they a meat eater or herbivore or whatever? And it rates them. And that I kind of like that idea that people always talk about tropes in competition with each other without necessarily realizing it. So I thought that would be quite a fun way of approaching the book, rather than the original way I started to write it was just a, how-to kind of guide. I thought, let's make it a bit more fun, because tropes can be fun, and talking about tropes and romance novels, I think, is fun. So that's where the rating system came from. For in terms of actually choosing the tropes, when I was doing my research, I picked the 20 kind of most commonly talked about, or the most popular ones that were kept coming up again and again. And then I whittled them down to what I could actually talk about the most. Some of them, there wasn't that much to say. There wasn't really much controversy, or the tension wasn't necessarily affected so much by those tropes. I also find that people, when you ask them what their favorite trope is, they say something like only one bed, which is actually a part of the forced proximity trope. So that made it kind of easy to filter off all those little kind of trope within a trope. And I use the umbrella terms to kind of make the whole thing a bit easier.
Yeah, I did notice that you kind of took main tropes, like you said, secrets. Like you took secrets and then you would like roll up like rock star or the royalties or like a famous person, like that all kind of rolled up into like a secret. Or even like if like you mentioned like dark mafia in the top tropes, as that's possibly a secret too. You kind of rolled them up into larger tropes, which actually made it really interesting because I was like, "Oh, it does kind of it folds into it, but I never thought of it in that way before."
Yeah, I think that it kind of came to me as I was going along. I was writing notes for 100. I had kind of 70 or 80 tropes that I still have in the list at the back of the book, but I had to whittle it down somehow, or I would have been still still writing it next year. So I ended up focusing on contemporary romance, and the tropes that were most common. Not only were the most common in terms of being favorite tropes, but also the most common in terms of being disliked, because that was nearly easier to write about and talk about than the ones that were loved by all.
Mm.
Um, there's some tropes that it was very difficult to find anything negative about.
That's fair, yes, and you kind of mentioned that in kind of like the controversy pieces, and when we were, I was reading it when you were mentioning gamifying it, like when you were saying like friends to lovers versus enemies to lovers, you were like, well, here's the high tension, but then you're gonna face a little bit of controversy. You had
Yeah.
mentioned it like in comparison to one another, which kind of makes me want a card game now. That you mentioned it. I just feel like a lot of writers are really get into it.
Yeah. The book designer was like, "Do you want me to design the cards for the book?" And I was like, "Yes, please." But I don't think we'll actually be able to make the card game. That might be taking it a little bit too far. But I think the addition of the pictures of the cards and those kind of competition pages upped it a level for me. When I first gave it out to early readers, that wasn't there, and I think they kind of missed out a little bit, because I think
Mm.
that adds a kind of more fun element to it.
It really does, and I kind of love that I had never thought of them in, like, comparison to one another, like like I'd mentioned kind of the friends to lovers to enemies to lovers, but you brought up some really great points on, like, how they differ from each other and how the readers might interpret it. When you were thinking about the categories like tension, banter, controversy, and believability,
Mhm.
were those 4 factors that you kind of rated everything on, were those based on what you were hearing and feedback from the writers?
Yeah, very much. Not only from writers, but a lot of my research was based on reviews. I read hundreds, maybe thousands, of reviews while I was putting the book together. and I, scoured Instagram and Reddit and all sorts of things, kind of looking for readers to get an idea of what things were coming up again and again, as issues. Yeah, so I felt like the believability obviously is a tricky one because it's fiction, and you kind of have freedom to, for it not to be completely believable. But there's a level where readers go, this just couldn't happen. This just isn't feasible. And you kind of need to think about that, before you send a book out into the world.
And that's a great point that you kind of had put that believability as one of the factors, because there have been, I completely agree. As a reader and a writer, there are times where I'll read something or like think about it and I'm just like, that scenario would not pan out.
And I think that comes from having a little bit of originality as well.
Mhm.
We tend, because we think that because we're using the same tropes that we're kind of able to rely on them.
I love that you mentioned too the originality factor, because that is something you did mention in the book, that sometimes, these tropes have been used over and over and over again, and they probably will be continue to be used. But it's the fact that you combine them, right? You layer them. I love that you mentioned that, because that's something I'm starting to see more and more in romance books, is that people
Yeah,
are laying them together, and that's how they're creating the original stories.
yeah. And that's I don't work for many publishers anymore. I used to, but I've heard more and more recently that that's what publishers are asking for, is for those layered tropes.
Mm.
Um, and I think a lot of writers do that without even realizing that they're doing it. But it's good to put a name on things and say, yes, actually, I am doing that. And I think what I wanted to show is that when you're combining tropes, like that, you can come up with something completely new. So even though it might be that, that two writers are writing an enemies to lovers in a workplace scenario, and they have an alpha male, so they have, the three of the same tropes. Their story can be miles apart from each other. They can be completely and utterly different. And that was kind of the idea, that yes, you can use those same tropes, but what you do with them in terms of making them unique and different, or maybe kind of subverting them in some way, and flipping them around, that, that's where the good stuff lies.
Yeah, and that's actually called out in the book. You end up using a lot of examples, but they're all different. They all funnel under this same trope, but they're different in some ways because they're either layered differently, they take place in different times, they use different elements. So
Yeah,
I like that you had such a wide variety of tropes in there in books that, like you
yeah.
said, they are wildly different from each other.
That was one of the other challenges. I wanted that to be the case. I could have obviously just plucked, 5 or 6 enemies to lovers books that were on my TBR and, put them in. But I kind of wanted to make sure that, number one, I had read every book. Um, I wasn't just kind of going on Instagram and finding a list of friends to lovers and then adding that in. I wanted to make sure that I had read it, that it had kind of meant something to me, or had been unique in some way, and to be different from the others in the list. So I think you'll find, that in each trope, the read list at the end, and indeed the watch list, have very different examples. That no two of them kind of are the same, even though they have the same trope.
Right, and I think that's so important to call out to writers, because I've talked to a couple of writers who've told me before, "Well, I have this idea for this book of with this trope in it, but I know it's been done before," and I've told them, "Well, you haven't written it before, have you?"
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think for with, if you're new to writing, um, what I would recommend is kind of picking a few tropes to start with. That can be a really good way of actually coming up with your plot. I've split the tropes into plot tropes, character tropes, and setting tropes
Mhm.
in the long list at the end. And I find that if a writer chooses one of each to start with at the kind of plotting stage, so if they pick enemies to lovers as a plot trope, and best friend's ex as a character trope, and then set it in on a road trip, those three tropes for character, plot, and setting, if you can kind of consider them and then start your plotting, you can already kind of feel where the tension would lie in that. If they're enemies and they're on a road trip and it's their best friend's ex, already you've got the kind of basis to a good story, I think. And I think that that kind of allows you to have some of the reader's favorites, but when you're plotting, it kind of gives you a focus as well.
Yeah, that sounds like an interesting book that I would definitely read.
Yeah, if you just pluck three out of the air and kind of brainstorm them, I think that's a really good way of getting started. If you're kind of thinking, oh, need a new idea. I personally think that's a really good kind of starting point, that you can play around with. And if it doesn't work, you switch it around. I think also layering can be really helpful during the process. If you come to kind of the end of your first act, say, and you don't know how to push it forward, what's going to keep these two characters together, that's when adding a new trope, layering in a new trope can be really useful to kind of propel everything forward, and give you your plot thrust. Forced proximity is really good for that at that point, or a fake dating scenario or something along those lines, where it's a way of kind of keeping your two characters in each other's company.
I really enjoyed that you actually segmented it like plot trope, and a character trope, because I hadn't heard it quite contextualized that way, but it was super interesting and it made sense to me. I love learning about different kind of tropes and kind of like analyzing it. So when you mentioned that in the book, I was like, that makes perfect sense. Mhm.
I don't think I saw it anywhere else myself, but it is kind of how I do it in my own mind. So
Yeah.
maybe other people won't do it that way, but that was kind of how I was able to kind of think of it and then organize it in the book. It worked for me.
And there is something for everyone in the book: new writers, experienced writers, and even romance readers. But you emphasized one of the most important matters of tropes, and that's expectations. Why is it important that we as writers understand expectations in tropes?
I do talk about reader expectation a lot. I kind of talk about it probably more than I even realized myself. But after doing all the research and all the reviews and with the readers, I did polls and things like that. I kind of felt like I had to share it with the writers. I think it's important that they know what readers want. In today's kind of writing world, I think as much as we love to be creative, and I don't, I would never want anyone to kind of completely write to market and not use their own creativity. I think it would be foolish for a writer not to consider their audience before they start writing or during the writing process. And readers, especially romance readers, know what they want. And if you kind of tell them that you're giving them something and then don't, they can be very, very vocal in their reaction to that. And that's okay if you are, Colleen Hoover or, Taylor Jenkins Reid or, somebody massive, then that's okay. That, those readers shouting about, your book in a negative way is okay. You can afford that. But if it's your first book and you're, getting 3-star, 2-star, 1-star reviews because they're saying, oh, you promised me Secret Baby and it's not Secret Baby, or you promised me it was steamy and actually you've closed the door, or faded to black. They know what they want, and if they don't get it, they'll tell you. And the way they tell you is in a review that you don't want to have, because it takes quite a while for you to recover from some of those bad reviews if they happen.
Right. And that's actually something I had talked about with several other guests who had done marketing, blurbs. Like they mentioned if you put in your any kind of call out of your marketing or your book that you have a specific trope, a lot of readers will go to that book expecting that trope. And if you don't follow through, like you said, they can be very vocal. Readers,
Yeah.
romance readers are incredibly very passionate about
Yeah.
romance.
I think the new way of marketing books now, we actually put the tropes out there. That didn't used to be a thing. You used to you just see the title, but now we've got, the title, TikTok made me read it, enemies to lovers plus, romance. That didn't used to be something that we needed to worry about, but now we definitely do. And if your definition of a trope is different in your brain, if you think of second chance, for example, as a second chance at love rather than a second chance at love with the same partner, then you'll have a lot of readers who don't define the trope that way and will call you out on it. So I think I use the book to kind of say, this is what I have found, the definition that is agreed to by most people. That this is what it is. And if you're not doing that, then maybe don't call it out as as that trope, to kind of save yourself some heartbreak in the future.
Exactly right. That's all I've been seeing as far as like with marketing as graphics. I think we've all seen the arrows pointing to the book and calling
Yeah,
out the tropes. And I've started to see it now in blurbs. I actually asked one of the experts that came on the show who writes blurbs for a living that about the tropes. And she said, yeah, it's starting to become a thing where a lot of times they'll call out the tropes, sometimes
yeah,
in the blurb at the end, because that's what's gravitating a lot of readers to their book.
yeah. I thought that was another kind of reason that I kept doing the research, was that I found that the readers, they wanted certain tropes more than others.
Mhm.
Um, but if they had a favorite author, I asked a few, because the one that had the kind of most controversy of all the tropes was Secret Baby.
Mm.
It was the one that, 8 out of 10 readers was saying it's a no, an absolute no. I'm not going to read any of them ever. And I kind of, okay, that's interesting. But would you read it if it was written by your favorite author? And that kind of made them pause and go, well, I probably would read it, but kind of against my own, instinct. I would read it to see if they could change my mind about the trope. And that kind of gave me a lot of hope that, yes, there are tropes that some readers don't like, but if it's done a different way to what they're used to reading, and it's done in a way that is more sensitive or just totally unique, then they will give it a go, and they they will read it, and they possibly will have their mind changed. So that kind of spurred me on to write the book too. That idea that every trope, no matter kind of how many problems or controversies there are with it, we can write a good unique version of that trope, and it might just be popular.
That's a great call out because that is something that I found that I've recently kind of fallen into is because I started seeing like a lot of recommendations for, let's take monster romance for as an example. And
Yeah.
I was like, that's very popular right now. And I was like, I don't know if I would like that. And I started to get recommendations from several people I know and I trust that said, no, this one's really great. You would like this one. So I read them and sure enough, it changed my mind that, okay, actually, I don't mind this trope if it's written in a certain way.
I didn't use any of my clients' work in the book. I
Mm,
kind of made a point not to. I thought, I had advice from other editors and things, and we don't review our own authors' books. It's kind of crossing a line that we don't want to cross.
Mm.
And it kind of felt the same way with this. But I kind of, in some places, wish that I'd been able to, because I've worked on some really good, unique takes on things. And The Secret Baby was one of those, that I had an author who kind of flipped it, and it was the best Secret Baby book that I've ever read. So it can be done. It can be done in a way that I think a lot of readers who automatically go, no, it's a definite no from me, would change their mind if they read a different take on it.
Well, and maybe if they follow you, right, on some of the socials, they might be able to find out what those
Figure out
secret
what that
babies.
poem is.
Yes, what that book is. Wink, wink, you know?
Yeah, yeah, I'll definitely find it on Instagram, on my Instagram.
Oh, perfect. And we did talk about layering tropes a little bit. Um,
Mhm.
did you suggest, layering both plot and character tropes is the best way to go about it?
I think if you choose one of the each to start with, a character, a plot, and a setting trope, that's just a really good starting point. I don't think many writers would choose too many tropes. It's obviously something that you have to balance. You want to make the writing process as easy for yourself as possible. So I would start out with with maybe three or four, and then see how you go with your plotting. If you think like you need to add in, a little element of fish out of water, or something different, then go for it, is what I would say.
And so that brings up a great question. Can you ever have too many tropes in a storyline?
I think you probably can, but it's not something that I see very often, or it's not a negative review that I've read very often either.
Hmm,
Um,
fair.
and when I'm working with clients, I think it's kind of innate, the use of tropes sometimes, because we read so much romance that we kind of know what works innately, and don't go completely gung ho with 10 or 15 tropes in a book, because we know that it just would be too much. So yeah, it's not something that I've found to be a real issue.
And that's fair because I haven't really heard of like a complaint of, oh, it has way too many tropes in any book really so
Yeah,
far.
no, yeah. I think it's probably just something that we just don't do.
Hmm.
Um, it'll be interesting. I'll probably get a manuscript on my desk next week, and I'll be telling them to take a trope out. But but up until now, uh,
Yeah. Up until the
up
time
until
of this
recording, I
interview,
haven't had that.
everyone, don't
Yeah,
worry.
yeah.
So, are there any tropes that proved really hard to rate or research since you did so many in the book?
Yeah, there were. In the first draft, I didn't use the umbrella terms that we talked about earlier.
Mm,
For the secrets and marriage, which combines arranged marriage and marriage of convenience. And when I decided to combine them, it was a real relief to me. It made the whole process a lot easier. It was hardest to write about the ones that I don't choose to read myself, honestly, because
mm,
I didn't have maybe a basis to kind of start from with those. So it took me longer to do the research. I'm not really a big fan of power imbalance. I like a bit of feminism in my romance, and so I tend to steer away from millionaires and billionaires unless they've been kind of subverted in some way.
mhm.
So that was quite hard. But the main issue that I had was to try not to yuck on anyone else's yum. I really didn't want to be that person that was going, I don't like this, so you shouldn't like it either. I was trying very hard to stay away from that. And I hope I did. I hope that came across in the book.
Oh, yeah. I actually love the fact that you kind of mentioned that throughout the book too, saying that, well, it might not be my preference, but there are a lot of readers who are very passionate about these specific tropes. And here and you were very transparent about that. I don't usually read this trope, like you mentioned, the secret baby. I don't usually read this trope, but I did a lot of research and here's what I found. So I
Yeah.
felt like that really did a great job of kind of framing it in a great way that made me say, okay, well, I I understand that she, may not like it, but I can definitely see why people would like it.
And a lot of the time I was steered towards things that, I wouldn't necessarily, pick up myself. And I ended up really loving some of them, and that was a good eye opener as well, that because that's what I'm trying to do for other readers is to get them to, say, well, I don't usually like this trope, but I'll give this author's take on it a go because it can be widely different from the one that I read that I didn't like, or even the five that I read that I didn't like. This one could be the one that changes your mind. And I had a few of those experiences along the way.
I love that you were so open-minded about it too, because it could have been easy to leave that trope out, but then you still went into it saying like, "Okay, I'm going into this hoping that my mind might be changed or in order to understand why people enjoy it."
One that I found that I kind of tried to avoid was the virgin trope. There was quite a lot of controversy around that, and it's one that I don't like personally, for obvious feminist reasons. So I that was one that I wrote up, and then I read it back and thought this is sounding a little bit too judgy. So maybe it's best to just kind of take it out and let readers make their own mind up about that one.
Virgin one, even though you mentioned it in, like, the glossary and the terms towards the end, that virgin trope did not make the cut in the book. Were there any other ones that really didn't make the cut?
That's the main one for contemporary.
Mm,
Obviously, I when I first started out, I had intended to write the book for all romance, and it got to the point where I realized that that wasn't the way to go. So I haven't gone into historical or Regency tropes, the ones that are specific to them. The same with paranormal. So I don't talk about fated mates or anything like that in this particular book because I think that kind of warrants a book of its own, which I will. I think I'm not quite ready to commit to saying that I'm going to write it because it's not the longest book in the world, but it was a long process. Um, coming, doing all the research and everything, and I enjoyed it. But I'm not quite ready to say, yes, I'll definitely write the historical version. I'll definitely write the the paranormal version, but I probably will.
Well, and I like that you kind of gave us a little teaser about that, hopefully, fingers crossed, but you also mentioned that tropes, you know, the virgin trope seems to be falling a little bit out of favor, I think, at least for right now, right? Tropes seem to be ever evolving. Like there are popular times and then there are unpopular times, right? They ebb and flow with
Yeah.
popularity. And in the book, you mentioned there were several tropes you hadn't addressed yet. Like you mentioned, the historical, the paranormal. Do you think you might continue categorizing tropes in with different additions, kind of like we just talked about, or maybe different types of tropes?
I think I'll probably always be talking about tropes. I have a feeling it's gonna kind of follow me around, and I love it. So I don't mind. And yeah, I'm very open to hearing from people who maybe have a trope that they think should be added, that I haven't talked about, or that if they disagree with something, I'm fully expecting there to be people who kind of disagree with different parts that I have said, because I'm one person and there's lots of romance readers and writers out there, so I'm not kind of expecting everyone to agree with everything I say. So I'm really kind of open to the conversation and looking forward to that. So I'll be talking about tropes a lot on my Instagram. Once the book comes out, kind of feel like when people start to read it, then I'll go into everything in a bit more detail with them, hopefully answering and or asking me questions. In terms of a new edition of the book, I think that'll be kind of organic, and I'll see what happens. There are definitely tropes that I have missed out, or that I have just haven't kind of found enough to write about yet, and that's probably going to change. So yeah, I can see it evolving over the years. Kind of back to the virgin trope. I love it, the new kind of subversion of that. I have lots of writers who are writing male virgins, and that kind of ties into the other book that I'm involved with at the moment, which is a fictional anthology that I'm compiling to kind of go as an accompaniment to the Top Tropes book. It's called Twisted Tropes, and I've asked 6 writers that I know well to come up with a new take or a kind of subversion to an old classic trope. And so they're all working away on that now, and it's going to be out at the end of March next year. So I'm really looking forward to that.
And before long, you'll have a whole series.
Hopefully.
Yeah,
Hopefully.
yeah, fingers crossed. That sounds exciting. So we've talked all about these amazing tropes in your book. So where can listeners find the book and how can they connect with you?
And the book's available on Amazon. It's pre-order for ebook is available now. The actual release is next Monday, the 24th. And I think a lot of writers will find the paperback. I like working with paperback books for my craft books. My whole office is covered in them here. So I find that's kind of what writers like, so they can highlight and there'll be room for notes as well in the paperback version, which there isn't in the ebook. So it'll be out next Monday. And you can find me mostly on Instagram, social media wise. Twitter scares me a little bit. So I tend to stay off it. And my website, www.aimeewalkereditorial.com. You can find out all about my editing work and my coaching and stuff there. And you can reach out to me there too.